want to welcome you to our webinar entitled Listening to the Voices of Survivors in Our Faith Communities. I am your host, Nancy Kaufman, Interim Denominational Minister for Church Safety of MC USA. Tonight, I'm very happy to be joined by Laurel Neufeld Weaver, MSW, and licensed clinical social worker, who is a field director and assistant professor of social work at Bluffton University and field education director of the Collaborative Master of Social Work program of Bluffton and Goshen College. The collaborative seeks to create a learning environment, equipping students for specialized practice in mental health with an emphasis on anti-racism and anti-oppressive practices and integration of spirituality. Laurel serves as a clinical director of Creating Hope Counseling in Bluffton, Ohio. Tonight's gathering is a webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in that chat for resources. Spanish interpretation is available using the global button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive the link in the follow-up email. Our webinars are also available on our YouTube channel, or you can go to Safe Church webpage to find a link to these. Please feel free to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. Only the panelists will be able to see your questions. We will also answer some of your pre-submitted questions as time allows at the end of this webinar. Please be aware that this webinar will cover topics related to sexual abuse and other kinds of abuse, which may be triggering for some of you. Your well-being is important to us, so please feel free to step away or exit the webinar at any time. A recording will be available if you decide to join at a more suitable time. And before Laura begins, I would like to open with prayer. God, we believe the church should be the safest place, yet there have been many times when it is not. And when it is not, then we have failed you, God, and have allowed harm to come to your people. We pray that you will help us to grow in our understanding through this presentation tonight on how to better serve our victims and survivors within our midst. We're trusting you, God. In Christ's name, amen. Laurel, go.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I feel a little emotional after looking at the list of attendees because our lives have intersected with some of you at different points. So what we're going to talk about today is called Listening to the Voice of Survivors in Our Faith Communities. Faith communities provide a framework for meeting deep and important needs and an important place to belong. A place to explore understandings of your interpretation of the world. Faith communities also create a place where we encounter our own vulnerabilities and often intersect with the misuse of sacred trust and power. What I'm going to do now is share my screen to share some thoughts that I've put together on a short PowerPoint. At the end of the PowerPoint is a resource page. Some of you were asking about resources. So give me just a minute here while I get that set up. All right. So as I was saying earlier, we have the title, and then I just want to share with you briefly what we are going to be doing today in our learning outcomes is to have a little bit of an understanding of the impact of trauma on self and faith. We're going to talk about the prevalence and scope of intimate partner violence, sexual and emotional abuse. We're going to build the congregation's trauma response. And I've given it the word a toolkit for accompaniment of survivors. And we're going to understand how complex trauma shapes our understanding of the world, and especially our sense of belief in a greater power and in a sense of the goodness in the world. We're going to hear directly from voices of survivors from an organization called Courageous Women that is from Bloomington, Illinois. And we're going to end our time together with some ideas of action we can take in our congregations in being responsive to survivors. So whether we talk about leadership abuse or being responsive as a faith community to a survivor abuse, too often we hear how survivors cannot see the church as a safe place, as a place where they can go without judgment, or sometimes even naming, feeling shame. Often there's experiences of discipline or feelings of where their leadership or their involvement is in the church is questioned. As I was preparing to share with you this evening in this webinar, I felt myself unable to think. My mind was unable to focus. I have been a therapist working in the healing arts for over 30 years. I know the science of how trauma gets stuck in the body and how memories can be seared into our being, but yet I was struggling to put together information to share with you. I would start to work on it, and I would either have two things happen. One, I would become incredibly sleepy, or I would break down in tears. I asked myself a question: what's going on? And then it occurred to me that this evening I'm sharing with you the stories of survivors, and I have a story as a survivor myself. So what I want to do is bring those voices to the forefront tonight so that we understand how violence shows up in our congregations. It's not something outside of our congregations or something in another realm. It's something right here in our midst. So a good place to start is to talk about the prevalence. When we talk about the prevalence and scope, we'll start first of all about talking about intimate partner violence. In the United States, nearly 1 in 2 women and more than 2 in 5 men report experiencing intimate partner violence at some point in their lifetime. This next statistic is very sobering. Every minute, 32 people experience intimate partner violence in the United States. 1 in 4 men in the United States have endured severe physical violence from an intimate partner. Over 47% of women have encountered contact, sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner during their lifetime. So you see, we can't not pay attention to this because it is here in our midst. In our faith communities, we have community of survivors. Every 68 seconds, another American is sexually assaulted. 1 out of every 6 American women has been the victim of an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. That's the part where I fall in the survivor category. About 3% of American men, or 1 in 33, have experienced an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. But what we also know is that when we're looking and trying to understand this prevalence and the existence of sexual violence in our society, we need to understand that there's an intersection with the vulnerabilities that each of those individuals bring. One of the things we've done a great disservice to survivors in is making it be something about something that's happening for them interpersonally or personally, or something that they have control over. A lot of times we've missed opportunities for naming some of the systemic and some of the other ways that people are in vulnerable situations. The ways that they arrive with a history, often things like child abuse, a history of seeing domestic violence in their household, poverty, neglect, not having basic needs met. They themselves are survivors of sexual violence, emotional abuse. We also know there's vulnerabilities of young people that are runaway youth. And we're hearing more and more about people being vulnerable in areas of being undocumented or immigrant status, persons with disabilities. And then a new area that we're starting to discover is persons that are dealing with unresolved grief or crisis. Another part of what comes into that picture is an understanding of the commonalities that happen in some of these experiences. And there's a thing called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which are traumatic events that occur in childhood 0 to 17 years of age. Examples include things like experience violence, abuse, or neglect, witnessing violence in the home or community, having a family member with mental illness, also substance abuse or a drug problem. There's instability. All of these factors contribute to what someone is facing in being a survivor. It's important to understand the element of vulnerability and power that is in play with a survivor. You are going to hear directly from women, courageous women, telling their story about being in relationships where people take and use their power and control of that relationship for their own gratification, for their own desires. And the thing that is in our culture, that vulnerability and power comes in so many different forms. Sources of power rest in age, gender, sexual orientation, race, physical resources, economic resources, intellectual resources, psychological resources, and life circumstances. I have had the privilege of walking with congregations in doing some trauma debriefing work after there has been harm that's been committed in the congregation related to a misuse of power. And one of the things that we discover together is how to help that congregation returning to a sense of control and recognition of care for one another. So one of the things that happens when you are a survivor is you have the entrance into your life of what we call trauma. And trauma really can profoundly change the way you understand the world and interpret things around you. This is a quote from Judith Herman, who wrote the book Trauma and Recovery. And she says, the trauma event challenges the ordinary person to become a theologian, a philosopher, and a jurist. The survivor is called upon to articulate the values and beliefs that she once held and that the trauma destroyed. She stands mute before the emptiness of evil, feeling the insufficiency of any known system of explanation. So what we're talking about tonight is really the church's readiness to respond to what I've just described. and how often people experience it with a sense of judgment, a sense of victim blaming, and a sense of shaming. Often there's interpretations of scriptures which enable abuse. Recently, I accompanied a woman to a court to help her fill out the paperwork for a protection order. And in that protection order, we outlined different types of abuse that were happening to her, both physical and emotional and psychological abuse. That same woman went through the experience of having her church remove her from being a Sunday school teacher, remove her from her being in leadership, because there was an inherent belief that she just needed to work harder at the relationship that which she was experiencing abuse in. We have to ask ourselves a question. What is going on there? What are some of the missing important pieces in our understanding and readiness to walk with survivors? So many times, some of the roadblocks that we see that contribute to the perpetration of violence and compromise on the safety of survivors and their children is the misuse of sacred texts. It's a failing to understand that violence in relationships, especially when both parties are a part of our faith communities, that it breaks traditional understandings of bonds, and that we can't demand people to stay in relationships that are harmful. It prioritizes forgiveness often over restoration and safety of the survivor. And it often leads individuals to not even share their story or even come out of silence of what's happening. The other part that a lot of times we don't necessarily think about is what happens to our internal belief systems with that sense of shame and guilt, and that sense of doubt that we have that can crop up related to, if I'm not being believed by my faith community, how does that reflect on my own spiritual life and my understanding of God? And so there's a direct connection to our faith and our sense, our shaking of our faith. There can often be a negative view of ourselves. There can be that sense, I don't have the right. I define shame. This is the definition by Brene Brown, who's one of my favorite authors, who, by the way, is also a social worker. I define shame as the intensely painful feeling of experience or believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. How is it possible that after what I've just described about survivors, those individuals feel that about themselves after being harmed by somebody else who misused power and control? So I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the brain and our response to trauma, because this is part of our equipping ourselves in congregations in understanding. So we keep using this word, so we all need the same definition. It's a unique individual experience of an event or series of events during the condition in which a person, that individual's capacity to integrate his or her own emotional experience is overwhelmed. That experience has a threat to life, bodily integrity, or sanity. It is something where we feel this, often have a concept of order of our lives being questioned, even in sense of meaning in life and faith. It's a time I talk about trauma is a little bit like getting a blanket pulled out from under you, especially in the area of safety. So how I've defined the world as my safe place dramatically changes with events or event that you experience. So there is lots of talk in our world about how we respond to our bodies respond to trauma. There has been amazing work done called The Body Keeps the Score by Bensel van der Kolk. And in his book, he first talks about our natural way of understanding what our bodies do, and then taking it to the next level, which is understanding that these responses in our body have also had us learning that our brain is actually transformed or changed by these experiences. It is seared into our memory bank, and it's connected to our emotional response. And so often there can be an alarm system that goes off that gets triggered. So we have a natural physical reaction, and you've heard this before, to flight, flee, or freeze. And I'm just going to go through these really briefly. What happens to our body when the fight or flight reaction is activated? We become hyper alert, we constrict, we might disassociate, and we might freeze. So there's different reactions that happen when that alarm system goes off. Hyper alert is where we're provided with energy to move us to fight or to flight. And that actually has a biology sense of our bodies. And we have an increased heart rate, we have rapid shallow breathing, we have cold sweats, and we have muscle tension. Or constriction. This is interesting. When our bodies constrict, we actually lose some of the ability to be able to have vision. We can have loss of hearing. We can also experience enormous strength. But there can be this idea of certain parts of our brain that are normally function go offline because our body goes into this mode of suspension. A disassociation is another thing that can happen where we have a numbing of our feelings or trying to remove ourselves. And the last one is freezing, where we are basically frozen and cannot react or do anything. The additional one that I've added, because I've heard this over and over from my clients, is that we search for human contact. We search for a place of security. So it's a very critical time where we're looking for connection from others. So like I said earlier, we are changed by trauma. And we know that trauma embodies itself in the parts of us where we feel fully alive. And we know that often our brains can have changes that happen. I'm now going to change stopping my screen to share with you the stories and voices of courageous women from Normal, Illinois. And you will hear some of these same themes that I've just shared from their lived experience. Give me just a minute here while I get this set up. Time with you today in just kind of beginning a conversation around the theme of our webinar, which is really listening to the survivors in our congregations and in terms of their lived experience, and also really thinking about how do we need to respond as people of faith. And I think a good place to start our conversation would be for you to share with us to help us understand a little more about what it means to be a survivor of abuse and kind of some of the forms that this might take. And I know in our pre-conversation with each other, we talked about how complex of a question that is and how vast the lived experiences of women and men and all can be in the area of abuse. So if you kind of want to start with giving us some background, that would be really helpful.
Yes, thank you so much. And I just want to say how much I and the other women who have chosen to share their story, how grateful we are for a platform to safely share some of the difficulties and how things could be improved in responsive churches. Because we all deeply want to be good Christians. And there begins the complication. The abuse that was reported by Our Courageous Women ranges from emotional neglect to verbal, psychological, emotional, spiritual, financial, sexual, and physical abuse. Many points in the continuum of intimate partner violence have been experienced by the women in our group. A number of women experience the effect of living with a narcissist. One of the strategies of a classic narcissist is to have a very pleasant public face and church face, but to demonstrate abuse at home. My experience was decades of emotional neglect and toxic environment that the church encouraged me to endure as not that bad. I was raised in the church, clung to the church, found family in the church, planned my life around the church. I put great effort into and found great satisfaction in obeying church rules and patterns. Of course, I would never have a broken family. I would give my life to keeping my family together, and I did. I poured my life into ignoring the emotional neglect and covert narcissism that was true. I leaned on the church for emotional support while I was married. I leaned on the church during a decade of my partner's refusal to admit he was depressed. I tried to lean on the church when I finally knew that staying in the marriage would kill me emotionally.
What did you need from the church at this critical time in your life? And I know that you had the ability to connect with some other survivors. We're going to hear from Liz, from Tracy, from Becky about this critical question. What do you need from the church? What did you receive? What was missing?
I'll speak first about my experience, and then I will share several other women. I asked for and received the support of our only female pastor in asking my husband to leave the home. I also asked for and received the companionship of a friend in going to court. What I needed from the church was several someones, including pastors, reaching out to me. I needed that in the time leading up to the separation and divorce, during the 15 months of separation, and in the months and years that followed. That was not offered. And so I took steps with the approval of the pastoral staff to bring together the group Courageous Women. And we originally started with 7 women in our medium-sized congregation in a Mennonite church. Now I'm going to give you a response from Tracy, who comes from a different denomination. Her response is succinct. Here's how the church could have done better after intimate partner abuse. Someone from the church could have asked to meet with me and just asked how I was doing. And here is another woman's voice that's anonymous, choosing to remain anonymous. The church should understand how embarrassing and humiliating it is just to come forward and to ask for help, let alone tell what happened. She continues, he said, she said is awkward, but doesn't mean you can pretend that people in the church should pretend nothing happened. She continues, Victims need you to support and encourage, not ignore or side with the abuser. My husband's terribly abusive situation. I needed the church to already have a plan and resources to rescue me. I needed the church to have taken action immediately at the first signs of abuse and not just told me to pray about it and wait on God to restore my marriage. That mentality kept me in a home way longer than I ever should have been and experiencing more trauma and abuse as a result. I needed the church to not assume that things had gotten better just because I looked happy at church. Just because I looked happy at church did not mean that the abuse had gotten better after I came to them to talk. In fact, it was the opposite. They did not understand that I had to look happy at church. Otherwise, I would get in trouble later, or he may not even allow me to come to church if I was not in an acceptably happy mood before we left. I had to play his game to survive, and no one at church noticed.
So Lynn, the stories that you are sharing from these courageous women sound to us like some concrete kinds of ways that we should be able to see the abuse, feel the abuse when it's in our midst, in our congregations. But we also know that what you're talking is about power and control that is being used by the intimate partner, the relationship. That's why we call it intimate partner violence, right? I'm trying to explain this to the audience, not to Lynn, that we call it intimate partner violence because it takes on a different life inside that relationship than it takes on to the public. And it's important to make that distinction. But Lynn, if you could speak to the nuances that exist often in congregations with messages that we send to women and men about the acceptance of being in a relationship around the expected commitment or the responsibility to care for that marriage.
Well, no one in the church shamed or blamed me. They didn't have any need. I had plenty of shame and blame built in from all those years of hearing marriage preached as sacred. No one shunned me or left me out deliberately, but there was no blessed space to deal with this whole new country that I was in emotionally and spiritually. When I was dealing with the hardest thing I had ever done in my life, I had no church companions. And now I'll talk from Becky's perspective. She says, when I separated from my husband, I experienced a mixed response from people in the church. Some experiences were helpful. Some women in the church who had been previously divorced met with me for meals and talked with me on the phone or offered to watch my kids. A group of Christian professionals not affiliated with my church invited me to join their small group. One of the members of the group had been through a divorce similar to mine, and she was incredibly helpful. I attended divorce care at a different church and found the community and the curriculum very helpful. But within my church, the pastors were not helpful. I poured out my story to one pastor and she seemed to listen, but then never followed up. Another pastor met with my husband and me, but the goal seemed to be to get us to reconcile. I didn't feel heard or understood in either case. One member of my church met with me for lunch and I poured out my story to her. At the end, she offered to let my husband and I alternate attendance at the small group. When I said I didn't feel comfortable with that, she said, "Fine, we'll take your husband then." I experienced outright rejection or no communication from multiple people I thought were close friends in my church. I'll begin with some remarks from Tracy. I was married for 30 years, and many people in our church and small group knew how difficult our marriage was. We were in small group for 8 years that knew our situation intimately. When I separated, saying, I want to be in a healthy marriage, I'm going to go and do my own emotional and soul work, and I hope that my husband can do his, and we can come back together. And I know it's going to take some time. And that was my true desire. But not one person from the church or small group came back and supported either of us. And I haven't attended a church since then. The reaction that you heard from Tracy is true for many of the women in our group. That is, that sense of not being reached out to caused a complete break in relating to the church. One woman in our group who experienced abuse could understand that her abusive husband was allowed to come to church and participate, but not that he was given additional leadership responsibilities without ever being held accountable for the abuse.
So, Lynn, I find myself really having a difficult time understanding, like, how did these church mandates or spoken language around lifetime commitment of marriage? We hear things like marriage is forever. Mark 10:9 that people pull out a lot of times is therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. How did those things enable abuse to continue and be supported within the church? And how did this contribute to that sense of isolation? Why don't we see that or hear that?
Well, we have a wide variety of what people have heard, among our group. I didn't experience that much preaching against divorce. What I experienced was rather sermons on the sacredness of marriage, the support of the patriarchy through calling God He, and the modeling of women in the church as over-functioning in order to make difficult marriages work. Lots of subtle messages absorbed by me as my duty to fix whatever was wrong with my marriage. I had made a vow before God, after all, and I was going to be a good, persistent Christian. I will switch now to the voice of Liz, who had much different experience. My pastor at the time outlined passages in the Bible that spoke on divorce and specifically talk about the grounds for divorce being adultery and abandonment by a non-believer. As he put it, those were the only two biblical grounds for divorce because God hates divorce and specifically mentioned that abuse does not count. He also talked about separation for married couples and how he had seen many marriages restored that way. The pastor and pastor's wife would share their story and how they had 7 rough years in their marriage and how God miraculously restored it. All this made me feel incredibly trapped in my marriage, and that I would be succumbing my entire future to one that involved not only unhappiness, but continued trauma and abuse. And then on a little bit different part of this story, she says, also, growing up listening to pastors talk about marriage, it was ingrained in me to wait to have sex until marriage, and that once I got married, I am to be the one with my husband, not withhold from him, and that my body is his. This is a biblical concept I knew, but I also felt that it set me up to not be able to notice sexual abuse when it was happening in my marriage. I was not equipped to know what sexual abuse was in the context of marriage, nor was I made to feel that I could refuse him. This set me up to be horrifically sexually assaulted.
I'm going to stop my share now. and just take a moment. We heard a lot from those women, and I just want to express gratitude to Lynn and the courageous women of Bloomington, Illinois, for their willingness to share their story. And the last question that I asked Lynn, which we don't have a lot of time to listen to, was what is the missed opportunities that congregations have in not recognizing the opportunity to walk with survivors of abuse? And she talked about how she has experienced this horrific time in her life, and but yet she couldn't find a congregation or people that could walk with her. And it was a time where she needed them, but also they could learn something from accompanying her and caring for her during that time. So, so the last thing is just to say, I'm going to share my screen one more time here before we go to questions. And it's to say that we want to think about what are ways that we can create space for connection, grounding, and safety for survivors. And we know that a congregation that walks with survivors it is really about supporting ending violence, encouraging survivors to seek safety and healing. It empowers survivors. It recognizes that relationships and marriage is based on mutuality and trust, and that violence has no place. It seeks accountability to those who harm others. And it provides space for healing and connection to community resources and for support. So before we go to our time of questions, I just want to have us all together look at the vision statement that comes from Mennonite Church USA and think about what are the connecting pieces from survivors telling their story, from us being equipped with an understanding of what trauma is and what individuals may have experienced in their life, and what is our response as a community of faith. So I'll read this out together. I invite you to read it with me. God calls us to be followers of Jesus Christ, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, to grow as a community of grace, joy, and peace, so that God's healing and hope flow through us to the world. Thank you for your courageous time of coming together and listening and hearing. One of the things I learned from Lynn is the need to do deep listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurel, for your presentation. One of the questions we did receive, because you were referring a lot to intimate partners, I know that some of our persons who have joined us, it hasn't been their immediate partner that has abused them. It's been leaders in the church that have abused them, or within schools, boarding schools and things like that, that they have been hurt too. Yes. So
I can answer, I can
yeah, go ahead
say
and answer
something
that
about
one.
that.
Just
So
say that.
yeah, so the introduction was prevalence and scope, and some of those statistics come from RAINN, which is the Rape Abuse National Network, and talking about the prevalence of sexual violence in all its forms, right? Intimate partner violence is only one form. And one of the ways that we have been involved at Mennonite Church USA in terms of responding to abuse is in the area of giving care to preventing violence with leadership in the congregations. I'm a trainer for Healthy Boundaries, which is a curriculum that is required of all pastors that are part of Mennonite Church USA, as a way of having an active engagement conversation about their role. All relationships of abuse have some element of power and control, but there is a unique relationship of persons in leadership. So whether that's a teacher or a pastor, because there's a sacred trust that's given to an individual, and then there's a vulnerability that's taken advantage of, that's used in that abuse.
Mm. And I think, we had said in our last webinar that abuse within the church or families, if it's in the immediate family, but they're attending a church, or if the abuse is done by all kinds of abuse, we oftentimes refer, to the sexual, but she even named emotional abuse. I don't think we understand that well enough, or spiritual abuse and bullying within the church. One of the questions that was asked is, what are the best ways to hear and elicit voices of survivors, especially in a congregation involved in discerning response to a sex offender?
Okay. Well, I think
Church.
the first one is finding a way that the voices can be heard in a way that respects what the survivor needs. There is situations where a survivor does not feel like it's safe for them to be identified, and that needs to be respected and cared for. And it also, so that would be something that first and foremost is to care for how that survivor wants their identity or information about who they are to be cared for. And then I think just overall, involving survivors' voices in determining what are some systems we can set up in our church for providing support, for empowering survivors, that it comes from the survivors themselves.
Mhm. So listening, yeah, one of the other questions was how to respond if a congregation has a limited access agreement in place, but the survivors disagree with it.
And I think that would be, first of all, I kind of need a better understanding of what the limited agreement entails. But in thinking about that, I think it's, again, doing that deeper listening to find out. It's often that we don't recognize the power and control that the abuser still has over that survivor. And so for what us might look like a very, so and so will act in such a way and this will be expected of that person, it might not necessarily play out like that, because that person has the ability to be intimidating or to, really make it a very difficult for the survivor. So it's not equal, is what I'm trying to say when we're looking at learning partnerships. We found when I worked at Crime Victim Services that a lot of the victim reconciliation mediation did not work in abusive situation because it's too hard to provide guidelines where the person that's been harmed doesn't continue to feel threatened.
Mhm. Yeah, and I was thinking of the limited access agreement. If you actually got to that place and you say, okay, this sex offender can attend the church, and we've got this agreement, as the survivors aren't happy with it, to me, it means we may not have done a deep enough listening to what is needed. And and then maybe are there pieces in that limited access agreement that are missing that should be in there? And how do you review that document? You know, sometimes we write it up and then we say, okay, now this is for time, eternity, or whatever kind of thing. But it is always good to review to see what is missing, what needs to be tightened, what needs to be adjusted, and is the sex offender abiding by it, and are we holding that person truly accountable to that? Well, okay, then, and you talked about misuse of scripture, which is common for us. One of the questions says, does Matthew 18:15 about going to one another to someone who has sinned apply in a sexual harassment church setting? And is it safe if you do that?
I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier is who's defining what's safe. It's really important to ask the individual that has been harmed, whether, you know, and who's doing the talking or asking. It is very hard to recognize in a situation when there's a lot of vulnerabilities that aren't maybe on our radar screen. It is definitely something that we need to give more care to, especially as you were hearing a lot of those women talk about. A lot of times there's expectations for reconciliation or for forgiveness, or, you know, a rebuilding of the relationship, or and a lot of those things a lot of times can just increase the harm.
And one of the other things here that question that was asked, how do spouses and children of victims experience their faith community? What have you observed in that, and what has been helpful and what has been harmful, and in some of your work?
So it varies because it's individuals' experiences, right? But there are times where family members experience what we call vicarious trauma, where even if it did not occur directly to them, they have the impact of their family member going through the experience. And so there's a sense of that kind of similar alienation from the faith community. Often people look for a different experience or a different community to be a part of, where that trauma is not following them, or isn't, because it's so hard to heal within that community if they don't feel cared for or listened to.
One of the other questions that was asked, let me see here. Well, and victims wanting to tell the story, like I think I forget what the woman's name was in your
Lynn.
your interview with her, but talking about, well, you know, you're telling a story and somebody says, aren't you over that yet, or can't you move on? What would you say to that?
Well, I hope that people heard tonight how trauma is something that we hold in our bodies for a very, very, very long time. And that it isn't, the other thing to know is our brains do not have a clock, right? So what I was sharing earlier about what happened for me, my experience of sexual assault was when I was 23 years old, right? And now I'm in my 60s. But thinking about being a survivor triggered for me that experience with emotional connection that was like it was yesterday. So the idea that we would just get over it is a not understanding of how our bodies are made to hold on memories, especially ones that are emotional.
And for some people, the need to talk it over and over and over again is a way of working some of the stuff out. Or if you don't think you have really been listened to, you may need to also keep repeating, hoping that somebody will say, yes, I believe you. I understand this, or at least I feel for you with what you've had to go through. Um,
Can I just say, Nancy,
Yeah.
that one of the things is that I've learned in being a therapist for 30 plus years is that what we don't want to do is create re-traumatization by having
Mm.
someone tell their story over and
Right.
over and
Yeah.
over. And we also know that there's other ways that our body needs to release it. Body work, things like yoga, mindfulness, meditation. What we're really seeking is emotional regulation, regulating our bodies so that when that hyper alarm goes off, I have some skills to know, Laurel, it's not happening now. You're safe and it's okay. And I start to teach myself new information because the same brain is amazing. It's this healing element that it creates new pathways for healing and for understanding and for reinterpreting and the world. And so and a lot of that can happen with connection. And that's where the church comes in, is that community of people that can embrace us and can help us learn to feel safe and secure again.
Mhm. Mhm. I want to add a little thing to with children and spouses. There's been a few situations that I've been aware of where congregational members knew something, was going on, or it came out publicly, and then inappropriately gossiped, so that I know at least in two different situations, where a child happened to be in the bathroom stall and heard some women talk about her parents, and that kind of thing. Or one was just happened to be behind a door and they didn't know, and they were just, yapping away, and so it caused more harm. Um, and we can all assume that in every congregation, because of the high number that you said of persons who have experienced abuse, that every congregation most likely has victims and survivors in their church, even if they haven't told us.
Right.
And so understanding, maybe would you encourage us all to be more trauma informed as congregations to know how to respond appropriately?
Yeah, and also I think we need to create a environment where we are we're saying to our congregation, this is something we care for and it's important to us. And so we're going to provide resources and we're going to be talking about this. We have to end the silence around sexual violence and find a way to be talking about the prevalence of it so that we can then talk about what healthy relationships look like and what kinds of tools for prevention that we need in our congregations.
Right. Any last thing that you would want to say to all of us? I mean, because you had said earlier, you have a lot in your mind and thoughts, additional resources, like, if people want to do more exploring of this.
I did, one of the last slides I put together is a resource slide. So I think that
That would,
you'll be able to send that out after the event. There is, there's a lot of different resources that are out there, but I think, again, meeting where your community is at and really providing opportunity for that deeper listening is especially important. because we have these opportunities within our congregations that we often are missing for providing truly a faith community that has safety as at the forefront for all of its members.
Mhm. There's also, and we could, send that out, a organization called brokentobeloved.org that would have a number of books on their website too for persons who have been abused by church leaders. And it has to deal with the person that formed that group also had been emotionally abused by a number of leaders on his pastoral team that he was working with. So, well, thank you very, very much for presenting with us. And yes, we will put your slides up. Those will be sent out. And as we said earlier, either on YouTube and on Safe Church website, you will be able to give our communication people a chance to get it loaded up. But on Safe Church, you'll be able to find some of that material too as well. So thank you, Laurel, for your work. You've done a lot of amazing things over the years throughout your ministry and that kind of thing. So I'd like to close though by, oh wait, make sure there's not any more questions and answers here. It looks like there might be. Yeah, there's a thank you to you, Laurel, and one of the question and answers kind of things. So we can talk about that later. But I would like to close this time together with a blessing to all of you who care so deeply about these issues and are trying to help the church be better. So I pray that you continue to grow in your understanding of creating safe places for all. Safe places where one can be heard, spaces that provide support, empowerment, healing, and hope. So go in peace, all of you, and thank you for being with us. Next month will be the one on forgive and forget ? The misuses and misunderstandings of forgiveness. And that will be March the 24th with Michael Danner. Thank you. Bye, everyone.